Hi everybody. So what this lecture is about is how your electrical patterns make an imprint on your physiology. And I'm going to ground it in everything else that we've been talking about so it all kind of comes together. And then eventually talk about, okay, so now we've learned all this, what do you begin to do about it? Cool graphic of your heart and the electrical patterns that it makes. Okay, so how we're going to do this is, first of all, I'm just going to give you a little psychophysiology review. And again, psychophysiology is just what we've been talking about. Psychophysiology is a fancy word for your mind-body complex. And all we've been talking about is how your mind-body complex responds to stress and how every moment of every day is recorded in our mind-body complex and then just creates the capacity for more of the same experience. So that's what psychophysiology is. So we're going to review a little bit about all that we've been talking about and kind of ground us in that before we move forward. And then we're going to go into the electrical imprint of your heart as it is under stress, and then again also as it can be changed when you are in a non-stressed state. And that's creating a new operating system. We're going to talk about some tools that you can do. And then eventually I'm just going to begin to introduce the EmWave software on that. And then an actual tutorial will be on a separate video. And again, hopefully you've already watched the introductory video. The EmWave software is some software in the Mind and Heart Lab that records your heart rate variability, which I'm going to talk about today. And doing that is an option for your final, and I would highly encourage you to do that if you have the time to do it. It's a really good experience. So again, you living in the body that you live in are a system of adaptation, meaning that, and again, when I say body, I just don't mean the thing that carries you around from your shoulders to your toes. I mean the whole human system that you live in. I am terming body, including your brain, including your head. It interprets all of your life for you. It tells you what to think, how to feel, how to behave, the choices to make. And the only way that it can begin to tell you how to do all of that stuff is by what it has learned by your own programming. And that comes from your own experience. So what we're going to talk about is, and again, we've been kind of talking about this the whole semester, but we're going to get deeper into one aspect of it today, how you get it programmed initially, how you perpetuate that programming if you just stay the same. Remember, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And how you can intentionally change the program so it begins to work for you instead of against you. Because again, being a system of adaptation, you are transforming every moment of every day. Whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, you're transforming every moment of every day. And so understanding the blueprint of how all of this works is the very first step in being able to change it so it begins to work for you. And again, so you have two drives. We all have two drives. One was our fear response drive. One was our calm and connection drive. You are always in one or two of those drives. We had to have both drives to survive as a species. Your fear response drive was the drive that kept us through away from danger. It's the drive that kicks in immediately, automatically, senses fear, pre-thought, tells you to react, and it is wired deep into our systems. We also had to have what's called a calm and connection drive, or we also wouldn't have had survived as a species. Because again, your calm and connection drive is the drive that encourages you or leads you to bond, to connect, to create community, to love others. We also wouldn't have survived as a species without that drive. Again, your calm and connection drive is not a lesser drive. It is not as quick and not as reactive. To survive as a species, we had to react from fear, way quicker than we could be worried about creating community. So the fear response drive is wired to be immediate. It's wired to be very reactive. And again, the problem is that in our current life, we're mostly in our fear response system all the time, because what we sense as threatening is so many things in our culture every moment of every day, rather than one big episode that we might have experienced way in our evolutionary past. So two important things. Again, you can't be in both drives at once. Physiologically, you cannot be in both drives at once. You are either grounded in your, sorry about this. You are either grounded in your common connection system, or you're grounded in your fear response system. The one that you are in most often is the one that flourishes, meaning it's the one that's going to become dominant, because you mold to every experience. You mold to every momentary experience. So the more moments you spend steeped in your fear response system are the more moments that are going to contribute to that system being the dominant system in your life. But you can also work to intentionally create your common connection system to be your dominant drive. Remember, each of these drives carries their own associated clusters of emotion. It's not like one has emotion and one doesn't. You have emotions that are very chaotic and very reactive, and you also have emotions that are very calm and very connected. So they each have their own clusters of emotion. And whichever one that you are in the most often is the one that dominates. But the next step there is you are always creating a greater capacity to live from whichever drive you are in the most often. Because again, it's like exercise. The more you do something, the better you get at it. So the more you're in your fear response system, the better you get at it. And you saw that last week when we talked about cortisol, how you just get better at being in a cortisol infused state. Well, it's the same thing with your common connection drive. The more you are in your common connection drive, the better you get at being in that. But it takes intentionality. It takes intentionality to make sure that we're trying to develop our common connection drive. And so again, I've talked about this a lot, and the reason why I go over this so much is because this is how we're breaking our whole class down. So again, it all starts with perception. This is how you are initially programmed, and again, we all have different perceptions depending on our different life experience. Every experience you've ever had is recorded in the wiring in your brain. Again, the experience is over, but it is wired in your brain, so you carry it all the time. And then the minute you have a perception, you make meaning of it. And then the minute you make a meaning of anything, again, this all happens in a split second. You have all these physiological imprints that's measured in your neural systems, it's measured in your electrical systems, it's measured in your biochemical systems. Last week we talked a lot about our biochemical systems and how we just get flooded with cortisol, and then we just get better at making more cortisol. But the big arrow here is when you have any physiological imprint, then you go back and you perceive everything from that state. The other thing that's really important to know here is the BRC, or behaviors, reactivities, and choices. We always have behaviors, reactions, and choices consistent with however that spiral is going. So if we're perceiving somebody to be threatening and it upsets us, and then we have the whole physiological imprint that upsets us, and then we go eat or drink or cry or fight or get angry, or we have any behaviors or reactions and choices that are consistent, and then these become their own spirals. So again, these spirals are going on every moment of every day, and the important thing is to understand how they work and then begin to be able to change it up, because it can be an upward spiral or a downward spiral. You're constantly creating the capacity for more of any experience that you routinely have. So we talked a lot last week about the biochemical influences when you're in your fear response system. This week we're going to talk about the electrical systems. We talked, neural kind of goes in two places. The neural is also in the perception, in your original perceptions, because it's all in your neural nets, how you get wired. But again, your neural nets also play out in how you perpetuate any circumstance. Because if I make meaning and then I tell myself the same story over and over again, or I just begin to believe something is truth, then what I'm doing is I'm just hardwiring those neural nets. So your neural system really plays pretty strongly in both of these places. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happens in a minute. So back to the very beginning, again, perception happens in the deepest part of your brain. This is the part of your brain that rationalizes, can remember stored information. This is the part of your brain that makes meaning. And right here in the middle of your brain is something called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the thing that records every experience that you've ever had. And it records it through wiring. And it records it, it wires more strongly the experiences that were more impactful, good or bad. And that always serves as the wiring that you perceive your current circumstance. So you are always, you can't filter your world unless you have your wiring to filter it through. So this basically becomes the programming and how we make meaning of our current circumstances. It's getting wired through our amygdala and through the deeper parts of our brain. But the thing is this right here, the amygdala is beyond your awareness. You just know how you feel. And when you feel something, then you just attach it to what's right in front of your face. So again, the amygdala is just, it creates meaning, it makes meaning, because this part of your brain wants to make sense of it. So when this part of your brain makes sense of it, it thinks that the feeling that's coming from here needs to be, or is probably due to something that's right in front of your face here, and it doesn't realize it's just being filtered through your past programming. And again, the idea of the amygdala is that it's just an alarm system. When it's in its fear response system, it's just an alarm system. But we react as if that alarm is true all the time. So again, that's kind of how our original wiring takes place. And it's not just in big threat circumstances. It gets wired stronger in big threat circumstances, but it gets wired to make meaning of whatever we do in our life. And it draws us towards the things that are life-giving, and it creates a fear response in the things that it's perceived in its past to be life-threatening. And by life-threatening, I don't mean, your whole life being threatened. I mean in threatening some kind of life in little or big ways. So the two important brain areas again are the amygdala and the limbic system. The limbic system is the middle part that kind of surrounded where the amygdala was. The hypothalamus is where all the biochemicals are produced. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that I was showing you that was over here. That was this is the prefrontal cortex here, where it's the part of your brain that tries to rationalize. It wants to make sense of stuff. It carries awareness and it wants to make sense of stuff. And again, this is what a neural net looks like. And so when a neural net first connects to another neural net, it does it through experience, and you have what's called synapses, which transfer information between the neural nets. And so one neural net does nothing, but neural nets connect to other neural nets, and they transfer information through synapses at the end of the end of the dendrites right here. And when they transfer information, that's how something gets stored in your experience. So again, every experience just gets wired. The experiences are over, but where they are is wired in your neural net. So the only way to get over the experience is to rewire your neural nets. I hate when people say, oh, the experience is over, just get over it. You can't, because it's still wired in your neural nets. But you can rewire your neural nets. And your whole brain is made up of these. Okay, your amygdala is made up of the same type of cells as any other part of your brain. It's just beyond your awareness, but it's still made up of those cells. And so anything that was originally wired, if you have a perception of yourself of being ugly, or you have a perception of yourself of not doing math well, or you have a perception of yourself of nobody liking you, or you have a perception of yourself of, being too needy or being too whatever, whatever we think all the time, we're not good enough, or all of that stuff just gets wired in our neural nets. And the more that we tell those stories, the more we just rewire those. But when we begin to tell new stories, then we break this wiring and we create other wiring. So once a perception happens, then you make meaning of it. And then the minute you make meaning of it, you start to tell yourself stories around it. And then you perpetuate those stories because you make meaning in your current circumstance. I think I gave the example of, when you don't do well on a math problem in kindergarten, and all of a sudden now you're starting to perceive yourself as being bad at math, and then every time you sit down to do math, it just perpetuates that, and the more you tell that story, the more it becomes true. And so pretty soon what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to change that programming, because if nothing changes, nothing changes. If we keep doing the same experience, if we keep behaving in the same way, if we keep telling the same stories, we're going to keep the same wiring. And the real question is, how do you begin to rewire? Okay, so again, once something happens in that spiral of becoming, we make meaning, we tell stories around it, so our neural nets fire the same way. Biochemically, I talked a lot about this last week. We release all kinds of chemicals. If you're under your fear response system, you're releasing cortisol. If you're under your common connection system, you're releasing probably a hormone called oxytocin or dopamine or serotonin, which are all neurotransmitters and neurochemicals or neurohormones that make you feel good. So biochemically, you are a different person when you're in your fear response system as you are when you're in your connection system. It's responsible for how you feel at any given point in time. Your reactions, your choices, your behaviors, all of that stuff is driven by what biochemical state you're currently in. And that is driven by what meaning you're making to your perception. Okay, so the third piece of that, again, we have under the spiral of becoming, you had the 3 physiological imprints. So every time you make meaning, you carry a physiological imprint. Now the truth is that these 3 systems are always interplaying. I'm trying to break them down for purposes of understanding them because they are different systems, but they all interplay. So your neural nets just fire to the same way, making more meaning unless you give it a different experience. Your biochemicals create whatever is consistent with the meaning you're making. The electricity of your heart, we're going to talk about the electricity of your heart today, and because this is a big piece of the story as well, and I've broken down the other parts, so I want to really break down what happens with the electricity of your heart. So while we do that, we're going to talk about the heart's physiology. So your heart is about the size of your fist. It sits in the middle of your chest, not on your left shoulder. It drives me crazy when people think their heart is in their left shoulder. It sits right in the middle of your chest. It is a little lopsided because it's stronger on its left side. Your heart is actually muscle, and it's not, we have voluntary muscle and involuntary muscle. It's involuntary muscle, which thank God, I would be crazy making if you had to think about beating your heart every moment of your life or you would die. But the left side of your heart pumps all the blood to your body, so it's got a little stronger job to do, and anytime you work a muscle, the muscle gets stronger. Okay, so in the top right-hand corner, right about here, you have something called the SA node, and the SA node is basically it's almost like a little battery. In fact, if you know anybody with a pacemaker, a lot of times older gentlemen, you might know a grandfather or not, they're not the only people that get pacemakers, but they're the biggest group of people that get pacemakers. All that is a battery that basically goes under their skin, because what happens again is the heart is muscle tissue. Anytime you stimulate muscle tissue with an electrical impulse, it contracts. So what happens is you have this little thing up here called the SA node in the right top chamber of your heart, in the right top part of your heart here. And what it does is it just sends electrical impulses through the 4 different chambers of your heart to just contract the muscle tissue. And then what happens is your heart is hollow. So it's like a water balloon. When it contracts, it just squishes the contents on the inside, which is blood. And then the blood goes where it's supposed to be. And the blood is carrying all kinds of stuff through your body, not just the blood, but it also carries oxygen, it also carries nutrients, but it also, very, very importantly, carries all the biochemicals that we've been talking about. So your heart is actually also classified as an endocrine gland because it also secretes biochemicals. So it's very associated with emotion. It's not just a pump. For a long time we thought that it was just a pump, but it's not just a pump. So it has its own intrinsic electrical system. And the reason why I say that is because the heart doesn't rely on the brain to beat. The electrical impulse comes from the heart itself, from the SA node. And because we always think the brain is controlling everything, and the brain doesn't actually control the beat of the heart. That's why when you hear often that somebody's in the hospital and they're brain dead and they just haven't died yet, because we actually classify life by the beat of our heart and not by the impulse of our brain. And so it's just really important to know that that beat of the heart, that electrical impulse, comes from the heart itself. And the only reason why I say that is because it becomes important later when we start talking about some of the ways that the electrical impulse then influences the rest of your behavior. It becomes important that it actually does come from the heart itself. Okay, so the SA node we've just talked about, the strength of the electrical current. It's also really important to know that that electrical current that is coming from the SA node is really strong. The electrical current from your heart is actually 40 times stronger than any electrical current from your brain. It is the strongest, by far the strongest electrical impulse that we have in our body. And it's sent through our whole body. I mean, when we do an EKG, we put the electrodes at your skin level. But the truth is, you could come down to the lab and I could put electrodes on your wrists and your ankles, and I would still be able to pick up the electrical impulse. There's an instrumentation that can actually pick it up, several feet away from your body. That electrical impulse is very, very, very strong. And the reason why I tell you that is because at some level that electrical impulse is being detected in every single part of your body. The other really important thing is electricity is conducted through fluid, right? That's something that you should never touch. If there's a live electrical wire, most of your body is fluid. So at some level, what's going on with the electrical impulse of your heart is felt through your whole body. It's just kind of beyond your awareness, but it's always sensed. And I'll talk a little bit more in just a little bit about why that's so important. But it is very strong. And so what we're going to talk about is something called heart rate variability and the pattern of heart rate variability. So when your heart beats, I like this graphic. When your heart beats, this is, if we were to measure the electrical impulse, if you've got an EKG, which measures the electrical impulse of your heart, this is what it would look like. The first beat is when the upper chambers of your heart are contracted, and then the bottom chambers of your heart, and then the impulse to do it all over again. So these are the strong electrical impulses that beat the different chambers of your heart, and that's how your heart beats. So the electrical impulse stimulates the muscle contracts. All of this is going to become important in a little while. I know if you're going, why am I listening to the physiology of the heart? It does become important in a little while. Because what happens is we always think our heart is consistent. We always think if it were, let's just say 60 beats a minute, because it's easy math, if it was 60 beats a minute, it would be 1 per second. And the truth is that that's not true. The truth is that your heart speeds up and slows down with every beat. It is not consistent. And actually, it's a sign of health when you have higher heart rate variability. In other words, more inconsistency in the heartbeat. So this space here isn't the same as this space and isn't the same as this space. It speeds up and slows down with every beat. And the reason why that becomes so important is because then it begins to make a pattern. So heart rate variability is the beat to beat changes in heart rate. So heart rate variability is the beat to beat changes in heart rate. But we're not really concerned so much about the heart rate variability itself. What happens is if you plot the variability over a period of time, in other words, if this graph up here symbolizes this graph as this is a time series graph of this. So in other words, this is each beat, and if this were 60 beats a minute, it would be plotted here. If this were 70 beats a minute, it would be plotted here. And so we can plot the distance between the beats. And the thing is it begins to make a pattern. And this is where it becomes really important, because that electrical pattern, again, at some level can be detected by every cell in your body, and that patterning is what is really important. It's not necessarily the variability itself, and it's not necessarily the speed of your heart rate, but when we start to look at the pattern that your heart speeds up and slows down, that becomes really important. Because what happens is that pattern reflects your emotional state. So what's going on with the electrical impulse of your heart? And again, it's a strong electrical impulse. And again, at some level, it's felt throughout your body. That patterning can be detected. It's beyond your awareness, but subconsciously, you're always detecting that patterning. And so if you're really stressed and anxious, it carries a more chaotic pattern. And if you're more calm and connected, it carries a much smoother pattern. So, and we call this level of coherence. So, and meaning that the more coherent you are, meaning that the more your mind and your body are working together and you're emotionally balanced, the smoother pattern that you have. And the more emotionally stressed or chaotic or anxious you are, the more jagged pattern you have. So this is where it becomes really important, because again, somewhere this patterning is being sent over your whole body. And this also becomes really important about why this electrical impulse initiates at your heart, not at your brain. Because what happens here is that, so this is your heart here, obviously. You can intentionally shift this pattern. So this is obviously a pattern of frustration because it says so up at the point. This is kind of a pattern of what appreciation looks like, or, you know, getting your breathing down, or all the tools that we've been talking about. Every time we talk about one of the tools, if you've been able to engage in the tools, you're already shifting your electrical impulse, the patterning of your electrical impulse. And again, at some level, these patterns are being detected all over your body. Some really important things that happen here are this pattern. There's something called a vagal nerve, and a vagal nerve goes right along your carotid artery, which is kind of down from your brain, down through your neck, down to your heart. The vagal nerve actually brings information up. Most information from your brain goes brain down to your rest of the body. But the vagal nerve is actually a really important nerve that brings all the information about the rest of your body back up to your brain, and it goes to some really important parts of your brain to tell you how to respond and tell you how to perceive. And so a huge amount of the traffic that goes up the vagal nerve comes from the heart. So, and again, this is why the electrical patterning of your heart becomes so important. This electrical patterning, again, it's the pattern that's important, not the speed, but the patterning goes from your heart up the vagal nerve, and two, guess where? It goes to the amygdala. So it goes to this part of your brain that's beyond your awareness, but its job is to perceive when something's threatening or not. And it's not just the things that are threatening in your environment. It's also the threatening symbols or signals that your heart is making. Your heart rate variability or your heart coherence patterns are like your body's Morse code. If you don't know what Morse code is, it's the kind of electrical patterning that ships use to kind of send out signals of whether they're okay or not okay. And so these electrical patterns from your heart are sending messages back to the deepest reactive part of your brain saying, I'm okay or I'm not okay. And the way it does that is by the patterning of your heart. So now it becomes really important, a couple of things, that it does come from your heart. And that it goes to those deeper parts of your brain that are beyond your awareness. And all you do is you feel anxious. You don't know why. You're not necessarily thinking, oh, my heart rate variability is very jagged or my coherence levels are jagged. What you're thinking about is, I just don't feel good. I'm anxious. I must be anxious or afraid of the thing that's right in front of my face. And it's this continual feedback loop. Okay, all of these, whether you're in your common connection system or whether you're in your fear response, it's a continual feedback loop. Because what happens is then these patterns go to the deeper part of your brain. The deeper part of your brain starts producing biochemicals. The biochemicals make you, and this is why I was saying that the systems totally interact with each other. Then your biochemicals make you feel anxious, and then your heart rate variability patterns or your coherence level patterns respond to that anxiousness, and then they send a message back to your brain to be anxious, and it's just this absolute continual feedback loop and continual spiral unless you begin to change it. And heart rate variability patterns are a really, really useful way to begin to see that you are actually changing what's going on in your whole mind-body complex. So again, where does that patterning go? It goes through, so again, you've either got a real chaotic pattern or you've got a real calm pattern. It goes all over your body. It goes to the deepest parts of your amygdala that are going to perceive anxiousness and not really it's not a conscious perception. It's just an awareness of anxious feelings and that we want to bring right to the things that are in front of our face. It also goes to the frontal cortex, which wants to make sense of it. And so what our frontal cortex does is try to connect the feeling that we're feeling with what's going on in our environment. So if we're feeling anxious and then my frontal cortex or your frontal cortex says, okay, it must be what's going on right in front of my face, and that must be the thing that's wrong. That must be the thing that's wrong. So we begin to make meaning of our external world by what's going on internally. Again, I think I started the whole semester saying we have the cause and effect backwards. The cause of our stress or the cause of our calmness is really what our internal systems are doing, and the effect is what we see. We always think that the causes are external, but it's really the effects are the things that are external. Okay, so heart rate variability, those patterns can be measured and they can be trained. And that's one of the things that we do with the EmWave software. When you go into the lab, and again, so now I'm kind of putting this in the context of talking about the EmWave, but I'm not going to do the actual tutorial is in a different video. You'll only need to watch that if you're actually going to be doing the EmWave. But basically you're creating a new operating system because you're going back to that spiral of becoming, and instead of just keeping that spiral going in a downward spiral because you're just in a fear response role and you're just going to keep up with that fear response role, you can actually train what your coherence levels are. And the way that you do that is you hook yourself up to, or anything, this is what we have in the lab where we actually hook you up to a pulse monitor. And again, we're not really concerned about the the speed of your pulse. We're really interested in the spaces between the beats and what the spaces between the beats are doing and what the spaces between the beats are telling us. So when you come down to the lab, when you hook into the EmWave software, and again, this is if you were doing it for your final, you do it 10 different times throughout the semester, because again, training, it is practice. You are training your coherence level, so it takes doing it more than once. And the more you do it, the more you learn to be able to regulate your heart rate variability levels or your coherence levels. The truth is, right now, every single one of you listening or watching to this video has your own coherence levels going on. They just are. It's not like they're just there if we measure them. They're there all the time. What the EmWave software does is just give you a visual of what's really going on with your heart rate variability patterns, and then teach you tools to be able to calm yourself. And the goal is to be able to do some self-calming techniques that you actually see the computer shift. So your goal is to shift your own physiology that you can actually see it happening on the computer. And again, one of the things I talk about a lot is the common connection system is like your highway of love, and your fear response system is like the freeway of fear, meaning that you have, again, whatever system you're in is the system that begins to dominate your life. But unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, because in history, in ancient evolutionary history, we needed it to be that way, that you have more neural connections dedicated quicker and more reactive to your fear response system than you do to your common connection system. So what that means is when we begin to train and intentionally try to cultivate a different way of being, we have to be more intentional about cultivating our common connection system, because we need to make up for the neural nets that are already more numerous in your fear response system. And right now, with our current culture, the way our fear response system is activated all the time because of all the little stresses in our life, we have to be super intentional about trying to create the opposite. And so one of the things that we're going to do in the class is called the heart tools. And you can regulate your affect. Your affect is your emotional state, and the heart tools are all about learning to regulate your affect. These are some of the more deeper tools that we've talked about. We've talked about present moment awareness and the power of pause and all of those. The heart tools are, they're a little bit more specific. They're based on all the science that we've talked about in the class, and they're based on 3 steps: notice, refocus, and nurture. Notice means notice when you're reactive, and so all the other tools that you've been doing with like paying attention to attention, you're just noticing where your attention is. But you notice where your reactions are. You notice when you have a reaction and then disengage from that reaction. Refocus is you refocus your physiology so you're more receptive to a shift. And then nurture means that you nurture a different impulse. And when you consistently do that, what happens? This is where you break the chain of the perception cycle, and you begin to make it an upward spiral rather than a downward spiral, because you're breaking the old chains by not responding in the way that you typically respond, but then you're also creating a new chain by responding in a different way. And again, your neural nets fire differently, your heart's electrical patterns give you a different coherence level, and your biochemistry begins to produce different biochemicals that are associated with your common connection system. So these 3 steps: you disengage, you calm your body, and then you engage in something else. And that offers enough of a mismatch that you begin to rewire or reprogram your old responses, and then begin to program in new responses. Again, it's not just pretending you don't feel something, it's not suppressing something, you're actually creating new programming. Okay, so again, notice any reactivity coming up. Take a few intentional breaths and disengage from its hold on you. Don't suppress it, just witness it or notice it, almost like from a third person point of view. Be with that feeling without blame, shame, or judgment for yourself or others. And again, these are all through your book, so you can go through your book and really read them a little slower and kind of get the idea of what they're all about. Refocus, bring yourself fully present, relax your eyes, your shoulders, and your chest. Bring all your awareness back to your breath and breathe slowly and deeply and comfortably. So this is refocusing your physiology. And then nurture is nurturing a different response. You're offering your neural nets a different mismatch. And so through this, you're beginning to create a different experience. And again, you mold to all momentary experience. So through the nurture step, you're actually creating a different experience, not just suppressing. It's not just about reducing your fear response system. It's also about actively creating or actively cultivating your calm and connection system. And that comes through the nurture step. And with all the different tools that we're going to talk about, the nurture step may be different. It may be just focusing on something that you really appreciate. It may be focusing on a sense of gratitude. It may be focusing on a sense of hope. And we'll talk about kind of the differences in some of the practices, but it's always in the nurture step, what you're choosing to feel. So again, what we're doing is rewriting your story. Because again, what we usually do is just telling ourselves the same stories. And by telling ourselves the same stories, what do? Is we just perpetuate that spiral of becoming in a downward motion. And so what we're doing by the heart tools is we're reprogramming our typical responses to responses that are going to create a different experience, and creating that different experience begins to rewrite our story, even down to the level of changing our perceptions. You can actually rewire your neural nets to the deepest parts of your perceptions of, who and what you are, or your self-image, or what you think people think of you, or how you react, or your capabilities, or all of those deeply, deeply seated perceptions that may be harmful to you are, again, just wiring in your neural nets. And you can begin to intentionally rewire all of those neurons into a better way of being, rewriting your story. Okay, and then so in the next tutorial, I'll actually show you the EmWave and just give you a brief demonstration on how to do it. When you come into the lab, you will be able to, there will be a lab assistant there also giving you a tutorial on it, and they'll teach you how to do it. But I am going to do an also tutorial just to show you how it all works.